Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm your host, Daniel Davis. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is someone who's had the courage to tackle a very big subject that seems to be about as elusive as the drug companies are about finding the right particular cure. It seems every time they dangle a pill out about some particular anomaly that we hear about on the radio, see on television, they make us uncover an idea that we have something we were unaware of, but hey, we've got a solution for you. Just don't worry about the 10 to 15 side effects it's going to have to be able to cure that particular symptom you didn't have before. But this one here has been so elusive, it's been dangled around and pushed around that it almost becomes sort of a miracle cure for these particular companies all by themselves. And that simple word is depression. I'll bet you, though, if you go to a party, as he says in his new book, Depression is Contagious, that if you were to ask 5, 10, even 15 people, could you define what depression is? Most people would probably give you just a different array of answers about what depression is exactly. We're going to be talking today about depression and what it is and how the most common mood disorder is spreading around the world and how to stop it. I'd like to welcome to our program today our guest, who is a clinical psychologist and internationally recognized expert. He lectures widely on depression, psychotherapy, and clinical hypnosis. He is also author of 11 books, including Breaking the Patterns of Depression, Hand-Me-Down Blues, and Suggestions of a Blues. And I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Dr. Michael Yapko. And Dr. Michael Yapko, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thanks so much.
Now, it was really interesting to read in your book, especially in the very beginning when you were talking about, how technology today has kind of changed the playing field about the way people interact. And I have to tend to agree with you that when you take a look at depression as a social disorder, the fact that we're becoming more and more disconnected from each other and having true, meaningful experiences, it seems that it almost becomes obvious how depression is created, but it's a little more complex than that. Could you please describe?
Well, when we look at the problem of depression, if we ask the question, what causes it, the best answer is many things. And that's part of what complicates its treatment, is that there are many different pathways in. Some of them are biological. Genetics makes a contribution. Biochemistry makes a contribution. Disease processes can make a contribution. On the psychological level, things like your personal history, your coping style, your temperament, your way of looking at things, that makes a big difference. And then on the social side of the equation, the quality of the relationships that you have and the number of relationships that you have all make a combined effort to increase or decrease people's sensitivity to or risk for depression. And so I've been focusing now specifically on the social side of the equation. I think that part has received much too little attention for how much we're discovering its power to shape people's moods.
Well, I agree with that, too. Now, you also seem to be, at least according to the experience of our program, one of a legion of doctors who are kind of saying, the traditional way that we go about treating anomalies or even symptoms, take a look at what it is, here's a pill, go about your business. That seems to be kind of changing as far as the viewpoint of doctors. It's a slow process, but it is happening. Can you describe what you've experienced when it comes to the pharmaceutical industry and how doctors are beginning to approach different things such as depression?
Well, I wish that what you were saying was really true. Unfortunately, while there are definitely a few people who are questioning, too many people don't. In fact, antidepressants are currently the most popularly prescribed category of medications in the United States, and this is something that is not only big here, but it's spreading around the world as people get convinced that somehow this is the way that it's supposed to be treated. And so it's an unfortunate thing. My argument is that as more people get medicated, that it actually increases the risk for depression as time goes on, because the method is all wrong. It's telling the person, you don't have to learn anything new, you don't have to change your life in any meaningful way, you don't have to build decent relationships with other people, all you have to do is take the drug on time. And that's, I think, a large reason why the underlying issues don't really get addressed and the problem keeps growing.
Mm-hmm. Now, I really, I guess when it comes to your book, when you talk about it being more of a, a social mood disorder, that as you start to lay out the context of what you mean by that, it almost begins to really make a lot more sense than something that is sort of a phantom. Okay, all of a sudden somebody's depressed, we really don't know why, here's a pill, here's a treatment plan, best of luck to you. But why don't you go ahead and talk about that and how you describe it in your book?
Well, the problem is that people think of this as only an individual phenomenon, that it's only something that affects the individual. And if you look at the larger picture rather than the smaller biological picture, if you look at the larger picture, you see some things that are very troublesome. One, that the rate of depression has been increasing decade by decade for the last 50 years, that the people who are young people today are up to 10 times more likely to suffer depression than their grandparents, and not just because we're more aware of it, but because people are genuinely experiencing the symptoms of it. And secondly, the fact that as you look cross-nationally, as societies westernize, their rates of depression go up. Third, depression keeps striking at younger and younger targets. The average age of first onset used to be the mid-30s. It's now the mid-20s. So the evidence is growing pretty rapidly that there's a social phenomenon happening here, that this isn't just about biology run amok. But if all you do is think about depression as an individual phenomenon, it wouldn't occur to you to look at marriages, it wouldn't occur to you to look at families, it wouldn't occur to you to look at cultures and how depression plays out in different cultures. And those are the areas that I've been looking at, and that's what is leading to the growing awareness that this is far more about social changes taking place, technological changes taking place, societal values changing, than it is about somehow one individual person's biochemistry going crazy.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's interesting, too, Dr. Yapko, is just not too long ago I was watching a documentary. It was entitled Consuming Kids, and it was talking about how the marketing and the advertising industry has been targeting kids, we're talking 3, 4, 5 years old. And as this child sits in front of the television and they watch the images that are coming to them, they realize, or they don't realize, at that stage of their development that they're competing, for instance, with a Harvard MBA in advertising. And it's almost as though they don't stand a chance. And, with these large industries out there, they, elicit things such as anthropology, human psychology, mental health, and the like, just so they can tailor these ads to get in there and hit these young kids. And I would wonder, through your research and your experience, would you say, because you talk about in your book about technology, especially the internet and the like, and the individual gadgets that people isolate themselves with, is this, sort of the beginning of how depression begins in many ways?
Well, it's one of the pathways. Mm-hmm. That when you consider the effects of advertising and the fact that the average American watches between 20 and 30 hours of television per week, you are continually being bombarded with a very destructive message. You're continually being told that whatever you have isn't good enough, you need something else. Mm-hmm. And when you are continually being told that what you have isn't good enough, it's not a big leap to whatever you are isn't good enough, and that what makes you cool, what makes you great is whatever you have that's cooler than the next person. It puts you on that never-ending path, that treadmill of having to get more and having to get more and having to get more, and that's literally how things become more valuable than relationships, which is why relationships end up taking a beating. I am astonished at how kids will steal from other kids. They will hit other kids, injure other kids, even kill other kids to get their cool jacket or to get their cool tennis shoes. It is a really scary thing.
Mm-hmm. Now, you can see, too, that as these children get older and then they get into the social strata of life, that it becomes more and more difficult for genuine connections because, first of all, it seems to be in an age, as you were discussing in that particular chapter, when it comes substance versus form. is the ideal that we could just mute, pause, or just disconnect altogether. For instance, cell phones.
Yeah. The ability to detach from other people as you get more focused on getting whatever it is you want is also what makes other people seem like pawns in a chess game. That you don't really develop a genuine connection with other people. It's just a matter of what can they do to enhance your life. What can they bring you? What can they give you access to that you wouldn't have gotten on your own? So it's literally how people become players on a chessboard, pieces on a chessboard to play, instead of really knowing how to relate to people and value the relationship.
Now, it's really interesting in your book, Depression is Contagious, is how, as we talked about earlier in the show, that we tend to be in a society where we look for a quick fix, we look for a pill, but you talk about how biochemically that just isn't viable for a long-term solution. Could you please describe that for our listeners?
Well, here's where the science comes in. Prozac was released in this country in January of 1988. So we've had exact 21 years of long-term data about how the medications perform. And when you look at the science compared to the marketing, there is a very large gap there. The drugs have not lived up to the hype. They do not do what they are purported to do. The advertising is way exaggerated about the merits of these drugs. People don't realize that they are serious medications and not happy pills, that they have lots of really poor side effects. But the biggest problem with them is that they only work for a certain number of people in terms of reducing symptoms. Now, the fact that there are only 2 countries on the planet that allow drug advertising, the United States and New Zealand, where you turn on your television and literally every 2 minutes you're bombarded with ads for antidepressants, ads for drugs for erectile dysfunction, ads for restless leg syndrome, drugs. It's about drugs, literally convincing people just through the sheer volume of advertising that these are medical problems that need to be treated medically. And the problem is, of course, depression isn't just a medical problem, and it is in some ways the wrong tool for the job. Even if you're a fan of medication, all right, even if you're somebody who really believes in the value of medication, you would still have to be critical enough in your thinking to appreciate that there are some things medications cannot do. Medications cannot make you a better problem solver. Medications cannot teach you how to gather and use information. Medications cannot build coping skills for you when you face stressors. And of course, the big one in terms of what we're talking about, medications cannot build you a support network, a social network. And so the importance of still going beyond the medications to learn the skills that it takes to live life well is really what my book is about.
Mm-hmm. And that's the one thing I wanted to bring our listeners to, is what I really enjoyed about your book is it reminded me of a guest that we had on our program a few years ago. It was The 4-Hour Work Week was the title of the book. And in there he contends that what you need to do is you need to do a couple of things. The big one is challenge your beliefs. And one of the ways you talk about doing that, or actually many ways you talk about doing that, is taking a look at expert advice. Now, it's really interesting if you're out there about your day and you really listen to people, how I heard this on the radio or someone told me this, and they'll act on that. You can stand there with literally pages of proof and testimonials right in front of them about the same subject. And because you're not somebody that everybody else knows, you don't have any credibility, so to speak, when it comes to name recognition, it doesn't matter how much proof you have that contradicts what they have just heard or the message they've received, they're going to go the opposite direction. It's like the lemming going off the cliff. And you kind of wonder, what is it with that phenomenon that people buy into the experts without really challenging or questioning, how solid the message is?
Well, that's one of the most dangerous things about it. And one of the things that I described in the first chapter of the book were some of the studies that were published in premier medical journals in the last couple of years that have brought to light the fact that data has been fudged, It has been altered. It has been withheld selectively. And the fact that there are articles that will get published in journals that people will then trust them and think that these articles are legitimate, they don't know that the journals are being funded by the drug companies. They don't know that the people whose names are put on the articles are experts with high name recognition that are being paid by the drug companies to put their name on the article, even though the article was actually written by the drug company itself. And it's the problem with what you mentioned earlier, form over substance, that the person isn't critical in their thinking. They just hear it and they believe it, and especially if they hear it often enough, so that when you think about how many drug ads you're exposed to on a daily basis, and every single one of them says depression's caused by a biochemical shortage of serotonin in the brain, and people actually believe it. And they think it sounds very scientific and it sounds very plausible, and the fact that there isn't any evidence for it escapes people.
Mm-hmm. Now, exactly. You even brought that example up about the New England Journal of Medicine, which is accordingly the most prestigious journal that there is about, medicine that's out there, and even finding that that's even sort of had its own ghostwriters, if you will, that are in there contributing articles and messages that really don't hold a lot of water. So that being said, as our listening audience out there today is tuning in, Depression is Contagious, our guest, Dr. Michael Yapko, is to encourage them to ask right questions when it comes to moving a direction they want to go. Could you describe that for them?
Well, it's a large topic, but the most important thing is that people have to be smart consumers. They have to understand that common sense goes a long way. Common sense tells you that depression's about more than just something happening in the brain, that it's something that goes on between people. All you have to do is think about how often people are the source of other people's depression. The people who hurt us, the people who betray us, the people who lie to us, the people who die and leave us. It wasn't their choice to do that, obviously, but you're still dealing with the consequences. And so the single greatest skill that people can have is critical thinking and knowing how to use information and knowing how to read through the biases, knowing that when somebody's telling you that we have the drug, who does that help? Who is most profiting from being able to convince you that this is a disease that needs a drug to be taken? And when you can see through the manipulations of self-serving people, you're going to be able to save yourself a lot of grief, a lot of trouble. Mm-hmm. So it's really an important thing to be able to do that. But the other part of it is just, again, common sense. When you're socially isolated, when you're alone, here we are coming towards the end of the year, and you have people who are deeply aware of how lonely they are and how disconnected they are at Christmas, at New Year's, the holiday seasons, and they forget that these relationships that other people are enjoying are built year-round. And it takes skill to do that, but you can't do it when you're sitting around by yourself cursing the world for whatever plight you're in. And that's really the first step then, is taking the responsibility for wanting your life to be different and then learning the skills that it takes to make it different. And I hope my book makes a contribution in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Now, what I really like, so people who are listening are thinking, okay, so depression seems to be a social disorder, so you really haven't talked much about that. So we'll start there. Now, you give a great example of a young college student who was studying. She really knew what she wanted, was getting excellent grades, had a pretty good defined ideal about career, but then she falls in love. She's attached to this guy, Timothy, I believe was his name. Then you put the fast-forward machine to 5 years to show how life turned out, how she was a mother of children, was telling all of her friends how much she really enjoyed being a mother. And the next thing you know, there's this underlying anxiety, as though every time, for instance, old college alumni would come around, she would realize there was a life that I might have had. And a lot of us tend to do that, where we're pleasing things outside of ourselves for somehow an internal self-approval. Talk about that.
Well, the quickest pathway into depression is to feel trapped. whether it's trapped in a crappy job or trapped in a crummy relationship or trapped anywhere. You can be trapped in a party you don't want to go to and you feel lousy about it. So it takes a lot of self-awareness to be able to know yourself well enough to be able to say, here's the kind of circumstance I need to be in to be at my best, and here are the kinds of circumstances that just don't work for me. Everybody's different, and this is part of learning yourself. You get invited to a New Year's Eve party with 5,000 people that are getting drunk and running around naked, and is that where you want to be? Or would you rather be with two close friends having a quiet evening? You have to know yourself well enough to say, here's where I want to be. And that's a big part of it, but it's especially the case as soon as you start to merge your life with somebody else's. As soon as you start dating, as soon as you think about marriage, as soon as you think about having kids, it now moves into a much, much larger arena. And especially the concern I have is for today's kids. When you look at the demographics of depression, the largest group of depression sufferers are the 25 to 44-year-olds, and they share many different common characteristics, but one of the common characteristics they share is they're in their prime childbearing years. It's really not much of a surprise then that the fastest growing group of depression sufferers are the kids of the largest group of depression sufferers. Just being depressed puts your child at a greatly elevated risk. The child of a depressed parent is anywhere from 3 to 6 times more likely to become depressed than the child of a non-depressed parent. And as we now know, it's not because of genetics. It's because of the social environment that you create, the family mood that you create, the patterns that you teach within the family in terms of problem solving and how you deal with value conflicts and how you deal with personal conflicts and all those skills that are a big part of living life well.
Now, our show is dedicated to people who are approaching in or just past the midlife marker, so to speak. Now, this is a time that people do a couple of things. They begin to reflect on their life and realize, have I lived the way that I've truly wanted to? And if not, what do I do about it? With the sort of anxiety, if you will, that maybe I just don't have the time that I used to have, such as when I was in my late teens or in my 20s where I thought that I had all the time in the world. Now, what's really neat about what you talk about in your book is how we need to stop thinking and reflecting and start doing, actually taking action. And you tend to hear people in this age group go, I really regret that I never did this. And I think at this point, this is sort of an appeal to a younger generation to begin to wake up and say, whatever you really inherently want to do inside, what your dreams are, just go do them. What do you think it is from your experience that prevents people from taking those kind of actions? It's almost as though they throw excuses of reasons, or things that block them from moving in directions they sincerely wanted to move.
Well, I think you just answered your own question there. About
I didn't mean to.
Well, it's all right, the excuses that they make. But, I think the first thing is that when people are older and they start looking back on their lives, one of the biggest mistakes they make is rewriting their personal history. That they forget the fact that the decisions that they make in retrospect, they might wish had been different, but they forget that that's not what was going on at the time. At the time, if you ask your mother, Mom, how did you decide to have kids? She'll look at you like you're crazy. She didn't decide to have kids. You get married, you have kids. Mm-hmm. You don't think about it. It wasn't a choice at that time. It wasn't until the 60s and the 70s that people could actually start using birth control and start making active decisions about family planning. And so, if at that point you already have a kid or two, you can't say, well, gee, I regret having had kids. It was never an option not to, if you think about it realistically. So that's really one of the first things that I would caution people, again, don't rewrite history. You have to remind yourself that the decisions that you made at the time were dictated by social forces at the time, which are largely unconscious. Things that you just did that you didn't really have an awareness of to not do. So that's meant to take the blame out of it. It's meant to take the self recriminations out of it. And then, there are some things that those opportunities came and went. You're not going to have a chance to do whatever it is you regret not doing again. And other things you can do. You regret that you never went to Tahiti. Well, see if you can figure out a way to go now. You regret that you never wrote that book. There's still time. You regret some things. There's still time to do. Mm-hmm. And that's really where the focus should be, is not on what you can't do, but what you can do, and focusing on the things that are possible. And, some of these may be limited by time, some of them may be limited by money, but the idea of what are the things that can still be accomplished that bring some meaning to your life is a very, very different focus than sitting around and regretting, why didn't I do that and why didn't I do that?
Now, one of the most empowering chapters, as there are actually many throughout this book, it's such a different book because, to me, you realize, at least so it seems, that when you talk about depression being a social disorder, if you will, is that you really place responsibility back on the person for the state that they're in the first place, and you get them to begin to question that. And it gets to a point, it seems, that a person really begins to feel a sense of personal power. It's almost as though depression is a way that a person has relinquished their personal power. Is that a fair way to say that?
I think it is a fair way to say that. That when you look at the two predominant forces of depression, they are helplessness and hopelessness. And when people don't have a sense of vision for what they want for themselves and for their future, and when they feel powerless to create it, that's what leads people into that sense of being trapped and unhappy. So helplessness is a perspective, it's not a fact. Hopelessness is a perspective, it's not a fact. And that's really the challenge, is how, as soon as you hear yourself say, I can't do that, that's when you have to go out and do it. Find a way. And challenge yourself constantly to go beyond what you think you're capable of. It means going outside your comfort zone. It means dealing with the fear, the anxiety, and doing it anyway. And it means pushing yourself to have the kind of life that you want. You, as far as I know, you only go around once.
Now, there's an interesting point, too, is that when you talk about challenging your fears, facing up and doing it anyway, people will sometimes tend to, just because they believe it's more comfortable, take on the role of being a victim. Where did we come up with the idea that it was just easier to throw your legs and your hands up in the air and roll over on your back?
Well, that's an interesting point, because many people have made the observation, and to me, that we become a culture of victims, that we are so quick to blame other people and not take responsibility for our own actions. So, the standard examples of the person who burns themselves with a cup of coffee they just bought at McDonald's, and instead of saying, I was careless, they turn around and sue McDonald's for serving coffee that's too hot, and then actually win the lawsuit. Somebody's drunk and falls onto the railroad tracks, and they sue the rail line, and it's ridiculous but true that we have become a culture where lawsuits are just manifest, they are routine, they are constant, and it's certainly a way of blaming somebody else for your own carelessness or your own mistakes. The person who walks down the street and trips on a pothole, instead of saying, gee, I wasn't paying attention, they sue the city because there's a pothole in the street. And so it really is a strong statement to want to take responsibility for your own life. Stop blaming your childhood. Stop blaming your parents. Stop blaming the people who treated you badly when you were 15 or 22, and start thinking in terms of what do you actually want and what does it take to produce it. And somebody wise once said that obstacles are what you see when you take your eyes off the goal, and I believe that.
Yeah, and you talk about that in your book also, is that a lot of times people, will put emotion in the way instead of looking at the result that they truly wanted and how that actually can create depression by itself.
Sure. So much of what determines your quality of life is your quality of focus. Mm-hmm. Do you focus on what's right? Do you focus on what's wrong? Do you focus on the future? Or do you focus on the past? Do you focus on good feelings? Do you focus on bad feelings? Do you look for opportunities or do you look for blame? And it's that quality of focus that is the single greatest determinant of what your mood state's going to be like and how effective you're going to be in living your life.
Mm-hmm. For those of you just joining us, we're talking with our guest, Dr. Michael Yapko. His book is Depression is Contagious, How the Most Common Mood Disorder is Spreading Around the World and How We Can Stop It. The biggest key, too, in what you talk about in your book is that relationships are very, very important and how you need to choose them wisely. We seem to be in a day and age, just as we were alluding to earlier, that we seek outside of ourselves to please others regardless of how internally that will affect us. Sort of like the bully on the playground. It's easier for the kids just to cooperate even though the bully tends to be making up the rules as the bully goes along, just so long as we're included in the process. And you wonder, what a part of human nature has us doing something that internally we know just isn't right?
Well, it's a curious thing that as relationships continue to suffer, as relationships continue to decline, people actually get more desperate for them. And then as they get more desperate for them, they overlook the warning signs that this particular person is not going to be the best person for me to hook up with. Mm-hmm. And so they instead of really being critical, one of the skills that I emphasize in the book is learning how to read people, learning how to assess them, so that you can better determine whether it's a good fit between you. You have to think in terms of what do you want from somebody, but what you want from them might be an entirely reasonable thing to want, but just not from that person because this isn't what they do. But if you're urgent, if you're desperate, if you so badly want a boyfriend or a girlfriend that you're willing to go out with anybody, you'll end up with anybody.
Now, that also comes to a key point, too, is how we have, as a society, seemingly as a whole, have gotten to a point that we're willing to negotiate our boundaries. And there's a big one.
Yeah. Well, boundaries are such a critically important part of any relationship. There are lines that you draw that define this relationship that you just don't cross. That you look at an obvious example of a parent and a child. If you're going to function as a parent, that means it's going to require you to say certain things and do certain things in terms of educating your child, disciplining your child. If it's more important for you to have your child like you than it is for you to function as an effective parent, then you're going to have some pretty poor boundaries that are going to lead you to overlook some things that this child does that you really shouldn't overlook. Mm-hmm. And that's how we end up with spoiled brats and kids with a sense of entitlement.
Right.
So,
yeah, I was going to go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was just saying boundaries are a part of any healthy relationship. There are simply, no matter what kind of a relationship you're in, there are lines that you just don't cross if you're going to keep the relationship healthy.
Mm-hmm. I know you talked about that in your book, especially when you talk about children and entitlement, how there was a particular student who goes in, doesn't get the A, but gets the B or the C because that's what they deserve, that's what they earned. And they got upset about that, so they start harassing the teacher to no end because it's almost as though what you said shifted is the idea it is no longer our responsibility to learn, but it's the teacher's responsibility to teach.
It's a scary thing, but it's true nonetheless.
Mm-hmm.
And, teachers will tell you how much more difficult the teaching environment has become. And instead of getting the support of parents are so concerned about their kids' grades and their kids' college options, they don't really care whether the kid is a good kid or an honest kid. They just want this kid to be able to go to whatever university they want this kid to be able to get into.
Mm-hmm. Now, here's what's alarming also is I remember probably 15 years ago there was a woman that I knew who had a young child who was in school, I think about the first grade, I believe it was. And I knew her son a little bit just by observing mostly. And the next thing you know, she was concerned because she believed that her son had attention deficit disorder. Okay. So the alarming part about that is that before you knew it, here this child was taking Ritalin, which is very powerful. And I said, well, what made you believe that your child's attention deficit disorder? Because what I'm seeing is a first grader just with a lot of energy. Well, the teacher said, and I said, oh, okay, so you didn't really go to a professional and find out any more about this. You just went with what the teacher said and somehow streamlined the whole process, and now the kid's taking Ritalin. Now, you take a look at a child and their developing brain at that time, and you take a look at how our society creates, in its unusual way, a sense of depression through children, as we said earlier, through ads, through technology, through cell phones, through the internet. And then we immediately say, okay, this child is depressed, let's go ahead and get them on drugs. Talk about how, whether or not that's an appropriate process to do in that context.
Well, the issue of antidepressant medications in children is a very touchy one for all kinds of reasons. You know, there are nearly 24 antidepressant medications. Currently, only one of them has been specifically approved for use by children, and that is Prozac. In fact, the drug industry was forced by the FDA to put what are called black box warnings on antidepressants for children. What that means is it is the strongest warning that you can issue that says that these drugs pose additional hazards for young people. And originally, the black box warning was only up to age 18. It's now up to age 24. That the potential hazards for using antidepressants with kids are pretty significant. But that doesn't stop people from prescribing them. There are currently more than 6 million kids that are on antidepressant medication.
Wow.
And the number of kids is increasing regularly because they are, as I mentioned earlier, the fastest growing group of depression sufferers. And I think what was particularly telling was what a North Carolina survey revealed. University of North Carolina did a statewide survey of pediatricians asking them whether they prescribe antidepressant medications for children, and roughly 3/4 of them said that they do on a regular basis. But what was particularly interesting was that only about 7 or 8% of these doctors said that they felt they had been adequately trained to be prescribing these drugs to children. Now that is a really scary thing, because if you ask the question, if so few of them feel competent to prescribe these drugs, then why are so many of them prescribing them?
Right.
And it tells you about the pressure that parents place on doctors. My neighbor's kid, Billy, got on an antidepressant. He seems like he's doing better, so I want my Johnny on antidepressants too. And if the pediatrician has the integrity to say, I'm sorry, but this drug isn't indicated for your child, all they do is go to another doctor who will just write the prescription.
Mm-hmm.
This is the byproduct of what is called direct-to-consumer advertising. And as I said, the United States and New Zealand are the only 2 countries on the planet that allow it.
Wow.
Other countries don't allow this kind of advertising, but that's how Prozac has become a very, very familiar term in everybody's vocabulary. People who are so casual about it, some even call it vitamin P. And it's
yeah, I've heard that one.
Yeah, it's really an outrageous thing that parents are willing to put their kids on these very strong drugs with all that we don't know about these medications. We don't know what these medications are going to do to these kids developmentally. We don't know what they'll do to them neurologically. We don't know what it will do to them socially. These kids are a living laboratory, and the fact that parents are willing to experiment and doctors are willing to experiment on these kids with these drugs, to me, is a real strong symbol of our times, of what exactly is wrong with how perverse our view of medications has become.
And I was just thinking, as you said that, the perversity of a genetic disposition now, that it's actually something that we've kind of created the morphism, if you will, of changing, our generations. As you think about the Native American tradition of think 7 generations down, what sort of an outcome will these adults have, an outlook, and how they perceive and work in the world? What will that look like? It really becomes quite alarming, especially as you say, more than 6 million children are on antidepressants. I couldn't even imagine depressed children when I was a child. We went out, we played, we made the simplest things fun. But now it's just been alarming. And I say to myself, and I never thought I would say this, Dr. Yapko, but I say this is a generation of children, and I'm, in my early 40s, that I simply don't understand.
Well, it's a different time, and that's why unless parents are extremely vigilant and parents are really extremely attentive to kids, but unfortunately too many parents are not attentive to kids, you have a generation of people who wanted to have children, they just didn't want to be parents.
Right. Now, what would you say to our listeners how we can rethink our way about the treatment of depression?
How we can, sorry? We'll say it again.
I was saying how you can suggest that we can rethink our treatment for depression.
Rethink our treatment for depression. Well, first things first. The first step is always get a physical exam and make sure that there isn't something physical happening, hormonal imbalances, disease processes, and so forth, and take a look at the role of medications and side effects. But in terms of rethinking it, the first thing that we have to do is appreciate that not everything that happens to people is rooted in biology or pathology. Mm-hmm. That there are things that happen in our relationships with other people that manifest themselves in our outlook and how our outlook clearly affects our mood. That when we as a society devalue relationships, when we think of relationships as expendable, when we don't think we need to have things like family loyalty or community support anymore, when we have the idea that it's all about money and material things and consumerism and just buying into whoever we view as being the celebrity of the day. Just so happens this morning they did a segment on television about celebrities who are famous for doing nothing. They have no talent. They can't sing, they can't dance, they can't write, they can't make movies, they can't act, they can't do anything, and they still get paid huge amounts of money just for showing up. And as a result of being in a reality TV show. And you look at it sounds extreme to people.
No, there's a lot of reality. Look at Paris Hilton.
And she opened the door for that kind of vacuous approach to life.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of rethinking depression is when you hear the simple cause-effect statement that depression is caused by a biochemical anomaly in the brain, you should appreciate that viewpoint only serves the drug company. It isn't true. That it's not that it's untrue as much as it's only part of the story. Yes, there are biological consequences for everything. There's a biological basis for wanting chocolate. That doesn't make it a disease. So the idea that depression is caused by many different factors, from things like diet and exercise and the quality of your coping skills and how well you can think things through and whether you're held prisoner by your own feelings or whether you're able to move through them and live with them. But certainly one of the things that contributes hugely to depression is the quality of our relationships, and that's what I have been wanting to draw attention to because it just hasn't received enough attention. Mm-hmm. And yet the volume of evidence is growing dramatically. And in fact, the more that we learn about the way the brain functions, the more that we study the neuroscience, the more that we discover how important relationships are in changing brain chemistry in measurable ways. And that's some of the really new science that people should know about, that all the new science is showing us is what most of us have known all along. Other people matter.
And that's so true, and I think it brings up to me an interesting observation when it comes to, for instance, text messaging, which is being all the rage. And when you talk about in your book how you perceive the world and then how you receive messages from the world. Now, that's so different when you're text messaging versus being face-to-face with somebody. You can read a text message, and all of a sudden you'll put into those words your own emotions of how you receive that message. Now, you may think, oh, this person sounds angry. But then you may, if you were in front of that person, realize they were laughing, joking, and being sarcastic. See, there's a difference in the reality there. Just as much as they may be crying on the other end, saying, I just feel alone and desperate, but you receive it as anger or maybe even as a joke. And it's so funny to see these people. They'll spend more time isolated trying to connect with other people than being in front of them.
Yeah, and that's what is leading to the decline of social skills. You can't. It's the illusion that people have that because they're on Facebook and because they Twitter and because they're in chat rooms, and that somehow they're buying into the illusion that this means more social contact. And in a very limited way, it is social contact, but it's no substitute for the skills that go into closeness, of how you get into an argument with your boyfriend or girlfriend or your spouse and how you repair the relationship following that argument and what allows the relationship to continue. Mm-hmm. That is a fundamental skill to the health of a relationship. And yet what happens is, because people don't know how to talk things through, they don't know how to repair it, they get into an argument, the relationship is over. Mm-hmm. Statistically, the average dating relationship now lasts 9 weeks.
Oh, goodness gracious.
Yeah, relationships really take a beating, and my point is you just can't learn the most important social skills online.
It's weird to think, from what we're saying here, and it just occurs to me that somehow we've made humans consumable. Oh my goodness.
Expendable, yeah.
Expendable and consumable.
Yep.
Strange.
Right.
Well, very interesting, very well thought out book that you have here. I really appreciate that you actually bring this subject on, because typically when you read books out there by doctors and psychologists, it usually goes a different direction. There's genetics, there's heredity, then there's all these other things that seem to relate that it's just, well, that's just the way the individual is. But I like the way that you tackle it more of a social way, because I kind of thought, I kind of buy into this, and I think it's just a wonderful book. Is there a website people can go and find out more about your work and what you do?
Yes, if they go to yapko.com, which is spelled Y-A-P as in pepper, K-O.com, they'll certainly get a lot of different information. They might be particularly interested in a video that I just posted that's about a 45-minute interview with a young woman whose focus is on teens and families, and so she draws out a lot of good comments about that. So people might enjoy seeing that interview, but there are quite a few materials for people to look at, and so I hope that people will enjoy visiting that site. Again, it's yapko.com.
Depression is Contagious is the book, and our guest today, Dr. Michael Yapko. Thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
You bet.
Take care.
We also want to
Bye-bye.
thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. Be sure to visit us at our website at beyond50radio.com and sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter. Great resource information as well. Also join us on our blog, where you can find many of our shows archived, including this one today. Be sure to also download it and share that with friends. Remember, getting good information and knowing what to do with it is key to avoiding depression in many ways. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.